listening to Vedge Your Best with vegan life coach Michele Olander. Episode 83, Vegan Inertia. Welcome back, Vedge Heads, Vedge Your Besties. This week on the podcast, we briefly discuss dormice. Yes, dormice. And friend of the show, Isaac Newton, makes a brief appearance because we're going to talk about inertia. Inertia. When you just can't seem to get that ball rolling. For the next couple of weeks, I wanted to talk about getting your plant-based and vegan goals rolling again, especially if you're someone who's experiencing that they've kind of ground to a halt. And if that's not you, well done, but maybe you are experiencing inertia in some other area. And I want to start by looking around at what constitutes the status quo for you. Status quo. If you have a goal, odds are that it means giving up the path of least resistance and the status quo, the existing state of affairs around you. What makes for a successful transition to veganism is seeing where the status quo, the existing state of affairs, has you somehow more comfortable not changing. Too often, we think that the state of affairs is just true, it's just real. But if we can give our consciousness, our brain, a little extra energy, we can say, yeah, okay, that may be true. But what else is true? Because if we want something that we haven't yet shown ourselves or proven to ourselves that we can do, for example, live a vegan life, if we haven't as yet demonstrated our ability to live in a vegan way, most likely we have a lot of thought energy that's been created around a current belief. A current belief that is something like, that limiting or eliminating the consumption of animal products is going to be difficult or is difficult. Most of us have our thoughts and beliefs that are adding weight to that current cultural belief that going vegan or plant-based isn't realistic or possible or sensible. And I don't mean this in a super woo-woo way. I'm not super woo-woo. I do dabble now and again in the woo, but only for my own entertainment. But as a coach, I see it. As a vegan coach, I see how the power of inertia, the power of the status quo is keeping a lot of us from living in alignment with our goals. Not just our vegan goals, but definitely our vegan goals. As human beings, we tell ourselves stories. We've talked about this before, and we tend to repeat a lot of those stories, and in fact, we start to think that those stories are just gospel, that they're facts. And if you've ever been annoyed, ask me how I know, when someone has poked holes in your story, you have experienced it. We don't really like to think that something else could be true, not about our special stories, that there could be another interpretation or meaning of our foundational stories. I'm sure you've experienced it somewhere. You know how we hold these stories so close. The stories of how we got here, what we built, what someone did to us, what we did to someone else. Sometimes we hold those stories so closely we don't even feel like we exist without those stories. Vegans, typically we have to let go of a lot of stories of what we think of as normal or usual or loving or practical or healthy. And if you were already a practicing vegan, you might think about this in an area where you are currently struggling a bit. Where are you struggling a bit to believe in your goal? But regarding veganism, there is a lot of received wisdom. There's a lot of talk and belief that being vegan is just not really very feasible, that it's not very possible. We may have stories that friends are unsupportive, or family don't get it, or travel's impossible, or it's no fun, and maybe it's too time-consuming or too costly, and that we can't really be expected to do it alone. A lot of these are just status quo thoughts from our culture, that it's hard or weird or unnatural or unseemly or restrictive or isolating. These thoughts have a lot of weight, and they have been reinforced by many of the people and institutions that we love and we respect most. So those thoughts may seem very true. I get it. But I'm encouraging you to make a practice that when something really seems true, when the story you're recounting feels really, really true, to ask yourself if something else could also be true. I think we ourselves are sometimes complicit, or if that's too loaded a word for you, that we cooperate, we feed the status quo or the inertia with our repeated thoughts and stories. And our repeated belief adds energetic weight to those ideas, like the idea that going vegan is impossible. Lots of people will tell you that. Or that eating whole food, plant-based, is restrictive or overwhelming or joyless. Even if intellectually we know better, and even if in our hearts or conscience we can feel that it's not really true, well, it can put you in mind of Isaac Newton, friend of the show. Isaac Newton, who put his pandemic to very good use in the 17th century when he was working from home, avoiding the plague. Newton talked about inertia in his first law of motion. And listen, I've told you on other episodes, if you're a physicist, you're going to have to behave and play along or leave the room, because I use physics for entertainment purposes only. So, in Newton's first law of motion, inertia is described as the tendency of an object at rest to remain at rest unless acted upon by a net external force. I think this is actually a good example for the ideas we have about the world that we have repeated, and that our loved ones have repeated, and that our culture repeats. Yes, it's true. Many people, maybe most people, think that veganism is not the easy, obvious way of living. But what else is also true? Maybe we didn't create that status quo. Maybe we inherited it from our family or our culture or our economy. But as individuals who maybe didn't create that status quo, we may still feed it. We feed it every time we believe it or repeat it or share it. We add to that mass of belief with the way we think and show up. And the greater the mass, the greater the weight of those beliefs, the greater the inertia. I think for most of us in this culture, most of us who were raised in a culture that normalizes mass industrial cruelty to animals, we can challenge ourselves to consider if something else might also be true. What if every time you found yourself feeding into that old status quo belief that veganism is difficult, You interrupted yourself. You interrupted yourself with a question. What else could be true? It might be true that lots of people and sectors of our culture think veganism is hard, but is that actually a fact? What else could be true? It might be true that one person's choices, well, that it might not statistically save that many animals, or save that much water, or impact deforestation, or stamp out zoonotic diseases, or avoid lifestyle diseases, or limit greenhouse gases. Yeah, that might be true. But what might be just as true? Could it be the feeling of doing your part, of not supporting cruelty, the satisfaction of learning more about the way we live here on this earth, and the way our veganism may help make it just that much easier for someone else? Veganism is just a commitment to a series of choices that seek to limit and eliminate the abuse of animals. It's already probably pretty easy for you not to eat large numbers of animals. It's probably not hard at all for you to not eat dogs or cats or sea turtles or dormice or use them for clothing. Yes, I said dormice. Dormice were a common food in ancient Rome. Do you see what I'm doing there? If I use a tiny bit of history in every podcast, it means I have not completely given up using my graduate degree. So, anyway, it's pretty easy for most of us not to consider that giving up dormice for dinner is any sort of inconvenience at all. And for most of the people I know, it's also pretty easy not to eat organ meats, for example, of cows and sheep and goats and chickens. Because bit by bit, more and more of us humans in the Western world, we've started to think a little differently about how we eat and what we eat for a variety of reasons. Slowly, individuals have been starting to push back about certain choices as food. We stopped just unconsciously adding the weight of our thoughts and beliefs to the energy around the idea that these animals or these animal parts are food. So we definitely know that it is possible. We know, we've seen it in our own lives and culture, that it is absolutely possible to start looking at something differently. Yes, maybe true that lots of people think certain things are normal and nourishing and good for you and culturally important and delicious. But what else is true? What else could be true? In every culture and generation, there are ideas that were standard and unremarkable that we start to examine and interrogate. Not always for the best, I grant you, but not always for ill either. The energy of our thoughts and our belief either support ideas, support the status quo, or they don't. Over the next couple of weeks, I'm going to revisit this idea. What else is true? Because I think for me and as a tool for my clients, this is a question of great power and potential. You all know I'm a babcha, a grandmother, and I have people ask me regularly how being a vegan grandma even works. And yes, it's true. My grandmothers offered lots of love in the form of animal products. True. If I stopped there, true. But what else was true? My grandparents changed my life because they were there. They saw me. They laughed and hugged. They sought me out. They spent time with me. They wrote me cards. They showed me the things they grew up with. They played games with me. They remembered my stories, my preferences. And yes, it's true, they did serve up a lot of meat, fish, dairy, and eggs. But what else is true? They were there, and they loved me. So, my Vedge Your Bestie, what true thing are you stopping at? What true thing is standing in your way right now in a relationship or in your business, in your fitness or health, in your veganism, or in the way you spend your time, or some other area of growth? Is there something that's in your way? Is there a problem that you would probably tell me is just true, that it's real? Maybe it's a diagnosis or a financial setback, or you think you're too old or it's too late, or there's a partner who's not on the same page. If you believe that it's true, I would just encourage you to wonder, make time to wonder what else is true. Your brain is amazing, but when you don't give it a job, it can be a little lazy. What else is true? And if you'd like to bring that to a coaching call, I would be honored to examine that with you. Because when we change something, things change. When we change the angle that we look at things, we see new things. When we stop adding to the inertia with our habitual thoughts, we can see things, ideas, solutions, distinctions that we just couldn't see before. And when we stop doubling down on the trueness of what is standing in our way, we can start to see options. So, over the next few weeks, we will talk more about this. I'm also introducing some of these concepts to my one-on-one clients. Ask yourself, what else is true? And in the weeks ahead, we'll have more questions like, do we ever really know how far we are along on our vegan journey? I love that one. It's been very useful for some of my clients. And the gift of being willing to be wrong. Spoiler, no one likes it, but you can learn to love it. If you're willing to feel wrong and keep learning, there is honestly not much you can't do. But more on that later this month. I'll talk to you next week. Vedge Your Best podcast production, music, and editing by Charlie Weinshank. Thanks, Charlie. Before you go, it would mean so much to me and the Vedge Your Best team if you would hit subscribe, leave us a 5-star review, or share with someone you think might be interested. Something about algorithms, it helps bump us up a little in the rankings, and that's the best way to help others find the podcast and for us to find our audience. So, until next week, make it easy and veg your best.